This morning our reading, the book of Ruth. We'll look at the second chapter. Page 208 in your Pew hymnal, or Pew Bible, excuse me. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to this young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she was continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants."
So there is a question that I think runs through our minds, sometimes consciously, but sometimes subconsciously, every day of our lives. And it is a question that the way we answer it affects the way we behave, the way we act, the decisions that we make. And the question is simply this: what can I do to win the favor of blank? And then you can fill in the blank. What can I do to win the favor of, maybe you're here, maybe you are single, and you came across a pretty special lady. And you're thinking to yourself, I would like to get to know her better. What can I do, right? What can I do to win the favor of? You don't have to say it out loud, but you can fill in the blank, right? What can I do to win her favor, right? Maybe I can buy her some flowers. Maybe I do some research, ask her friends, what kind of flowers does she like? Maybe I can try to take her out to dinner and figure out what she likes to eat. What can I do to win the favor of? Fill in the blank. Maybe you're getting ready to go back to school. Anybody, students here, going to school in the fall, excited about that? Okay, nope, all right. And you're going to find yourself in class, and maybe you didn't do so well last year. You want to get good grades this year, and so you're in class, and a teacher gives you an assignment, and you really want a good grade. So what do? You go to the teacher maybe, and you ask the teacher, what do I need to do to be successful in this assignment? And of course, what are you really asking is you're saying, what can I do to win your favor? Maybe you are currently looking for a job, and you are going into an interview. And you know that the person who is interviewing you is going to be the one that makes a decision on whether or not you get that job, or maybe you're going for a promotion in your company and you're going in for a conversation with those people who are going to make the decisions. So what are you thinking to yourself? You're thinking, what can I do to win the favor of? You fill in the blank. You see, this question, it dominates the way we think. It dominates the way we approach life. Now, as we come to this passage, I would suggest that this question is actually taken up a notch. We're going to see that that question is certainly present, but we see that actually it gets taken up another notch. And I would suggest that this passage helps to address another question, and that's this: what can I do to win the favor of God? Today we are continuing in our series on the book of Ruth, a series that we began several weeks ago, and we have just been working through the book of Ruth. We come now to the second chapter, right? The first couple weeks we went through the first chapter, and as we read the first chapter, right, we are introduced to Naomi, and based on the first chapter, you might come to think that Naomi is sort of the main character, right, of this story. But then as you come into chapter 2, you discover, oh, actually, no, there's a switch. Naomi isn't actually the main character of this story, right? If we were to take the book of Ruth and turn it into a movie, and have you ever thought about that? Think about who, like mainstream movie stars, who could play these different roles. Laura and I were kind of having fun talking about that. We think Meryl Streep would be really good at Naomi. We think she could play a really good, bitter old lady, right? And then we don't know, Ruth, maybe Zendaya for Ruth? I don't know. You guys can be thinking about this. But here's the thing is that suppose they did a great job and Meryl Streep gets nominated for an Academy Award, which she probably would, for playing Naomi. She would not get nominated for Best Actress. She would get nominated for Best Supporting Actress. Though you wouldn't think that based on the first chapter, right? She's the focus, but then when you move into the second chapter, she begins to recede away, and now Ruth emerges as the main character. And so this shift from the focus on Naomi to Ruth actually invites a kind of comparison between these two women. And of course, the comparison between these two women is incredibly stark, right? Naomi, let's just be honest, Naomi is a miserable, bitter old woman who has seemingly lost all faith, lost all hope. And then you've got Ruth. You've got this young woman, optimistic woman, this loyal woman who has faith and hope. And no doubt, as you read this and you sort of think to yourself, I don't know, who does God want me to emulate more? Naomi or Ruth, right? Obviously, Ruth is setting an example, right, for us in terms of how God would want us to live. And what's fascinating about that, what's so shocking about that, is that Ruth is not the one you would expect to be playing this role, because Ruth is an outsider. Ruth is not an Israelite. Ruth is not one who grew up in the church. Ruth is not what Naomi is, the one who grew up hearing the word of the Lord, worshiping God, hearing the scriptures. But we see that Ruth is this Moabite woman, this outsider, who actually in this story seems to demonstrate what it looks like to follow God better than the insider, better than Naomi the church girl, better than the Israelite. A number of scholars have tried to assess and look behind the scenes at what was going on in this time, and in particular, what made this story so popular, right? We know that in God's providence, he orchestrated such that we would have this book. But if you look at what was going on socially, a number of scholars have tried to kind of surmise, why did the book of Ruth become popular? Why is it in the Bible? And some of them have kind of argued, it's an interesting kind of argument, that maybe during the time of David, this story became very popular. And that maybe even David and his supporters, that they pushed this story. They wanted people to hear this story because it helped to give legitimacy to his reign. One of the things that we find is that King David, his rise to power was certainly shrouded in controversy. We find that the Bible goes to great lengths to make it clear that David was not a usurper. He did not try to take the kingdom from Saul, right? He tried to be loyal to Saul and all of this. But nonetheless, many, for sure, would have been suspicious because, generally speaking, in the ancient world, the way monarchies operated and the way the successions would take place is they were hereditary monarchies. And so usually, if somebody who came to power was not the son of the king, usually it was because there was some sort of a coup or something like that. And so there would have been a lot of controversy around the whole idea of David becoming king in the first place. And then to add to the controversy, we discover that a substantial portion of David's power base were actually non-Israelites. We discover that his military had a strong contingency of Philistine mercenaries that were, a part of his military. And then even in when he became king, he included a lot of foreigners, like in the building of his palace. And so it seemed like there was actually a huge openness, right, to immigrants. There was an openness to others being outside of Israel, being involved in the operations of Israel. And so people would have been, kind of suspicious of this. And so this story, right, of a Moabite woman, an outsider, exemplifying what it looks to be a follower of God, would have helped their cause. So some have suggested that perhaps that's one of the reasons why it became important. For our purposes, I'd just say this. Look, if you're new to this church, if you're new to the faith, don't think that you don't have a place in this church. In fact, don't think that you don't have a place to even set an example for us. We need you. We want to raise up a whole crop of Moabites, those who came from outside the church, who come into the church and decide they want to follow God, and they begin to set an example even for those of us who maybe have walked in the faith, have been a part of the church for many years. No matter what your background is, you're welcome here, and we encourage you, we exhort you. God may want you to set an example for what it looks like to follow him, as Ruth does in this story. Okay, now, question becomes, how does Ruth set this example? Right? What exactly does Ruth do? And we discover what Ruth does through the words of Boaz. Boaz tells us what it is that Ruth does. Okay, who is Boaz? Well, let's find out. Chapter 2, verse 1. Here we go. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Okay, guys, how many of you guys here, have you ever had this happen to you? Have you ever gotten suckered into watching a chick flick? Right? Ever had that happen before? Right? So like you're... a bunch. I mean, the hands are just flying up. It's just, oh my goodness. Wow. It's almost like an altar call and the hand just went up. Okay, so, you come home and your wife's, it's a Friday night and your wife's like, hey, let's watch a movie. There's a new movie on Netflix. I think you'll really like it. And you're like, oh, great. What's it about? She's like, it's a war movie. And you're like, yeah, okay, sweet, hon, thanks. And it's got like Matt Damon or Chris Hemsworth, something like that. And sure enough, the first 10 minutes, right, there's just bullets flying over his head. And you're like, you just can't believe this. You're like, my wife picked a war movie. This is unbelievable. Thank you, honey, right? But then, 10 minutes in, he comes home from the war. You're like, what? Who comes home from the war 10 minutes into a war movie? What is going on here? Go back, right? So he comes home from the war, and 11 minutes in, he meets her. And that's when you realize you got suckered into a chick flick. Guys, I hate to say it, but that's what has happened to you this morning. Here with the book of Ruth, you have been suckered into a chick flick. I apologize, but it's really just the case, because the reality is that the first 2 weeks of this series, as we go through chapter 1, right, you're led to believe there is no chance for romance here, right? I mean, it's not a war movie, okay? It's a drama, which is doable. It's not your favorite, but you can at least deal with that, right? And you're led to believe there's no romance, because what happens, right? So Naomi and her husband Elimelech and her 2 sons. They go to Moab, right? And the 2 sons, they marry 2 Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. But then what happens? The men all die. They're dead. I mean, there's no chance for romance. And then, get this, then there's this point where Naomi is coming back to Israel, back to Judah, and Ruth is like, hey, we want to come. Orpah's like, we want to come. And what does Naomi say? Naomi's like, don't come back with me, because there's going to be no romance if you come back. You're not going to find anybody if you come back with me, right? You're going to wait for me to have children and wait for my children to grow up, and then you're going to marry them. I mean, in other words, Naomi makes it clear there is no chance for romance if you come back, right? Which is bad news for Ruth and Orpah. It's good news for the guys who don't want to get suckered into a chick flick, right? But then you come to chapter 2 and you discover you've been lied to. What you discover is that things aren't as bad as Naomi has painted them to be. And in that, I actually think we see kind of a first point that emerges, and here's what it is. Here's the first point. When you are bitter, you tend to exaggerate how bad things are. Isn't that true? Right, we saw last week that Naomi changes her name to Mara, which is intentional because the Hebrew word for bitter is marar. And so she's basically saying, just call me bitter. I'm a bitter old woman, right? And so we saw her bitterness last week. And here we see what happens when you are bitter is that you tend to exaggerate how bad things are, right? Right? You get fired at work. And honestly, that boss, I mean, the things you say about that boss, right? You exaggerate maybe how bad they really are. A relationship ends, and the things that you say about your ex, I mean, you just exaggerate how bad things really are. This is something that we tend to do when we're bitter. Let me see this with Naomi. Okay, so she exaggerates. Boy, does she exaggerates and lies to us, telling us this isn't going to turn into a chick flick, and sure enough, it does. Okay, so let's move through here. So Ruth and Naomi, they come, and let's go beginning here in verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. Okay, so here, Ruth and Naomi, they are in a place of destitution, right? We think about what has happened to them. They've lost their husbands. They've been forced to move first from Judah to Moab and now back. And so they would have been in a very difficult place economically. And so really they're forced to essentially beg. But what Ruth knows, what she's come to understand, we would imagine, is that here in Israel, she's sort of she and Naomi are banking on the fact that one of these farmers in one of these fields, that they are going to adhere to the law of Moses. That they're going to adhere to the commands that were given to them. And what we find is in the law of Moses, we discover that God commands the people to care for those who are poor, care for those who are needy. And so they're kind of banking on that. Listen to what it says in the book of Leviticus, commanding these landowners what to do with their fields. Here's what it says. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. You see what it's saying here? It's saying, when you harvest your land, don't just strip all of the fruit. Don't take everything. Leave some of it for the poor and for the sojourner. Right? The sojourner is the outsider and potentially the immigrant. Friends, look, just to get really controversial here for a minute. Immigration is a really hot topic. I don't know if you know that. Really hot topic in our country today. And I would suggest we have to be careful not to be pulled in either direction into simplistic analyses of what should be done. We have to be careful. We can be pulled into simplistic approaches, and we have to realize that our approach to this is complex. The situation isn't always the same in every era and every time and all this, right? So it's complex. We need to realize that. But we must realize at its most basic level, we as Christians must have a basic posture of compassion towards the immigrant. That should always be our basic posture towards them, is compassion, because this is precisely what is commanded in the law. All right, so Ruth is banking on this. So here we go into verse 3. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Right here, the writer of Ruth, and we don't actually know who finally wrote this story down, but we can see sort of there's some tongue-in-cheek going on here, right? She just so happened to end up in this field. And ultimately what it's getting at is that God is behind this, right? God is orchestrating. He is at work in those things that seem to just be happening at random, by chance. Any Monopoly fans here? Anybody love to play Monopoly? Yeah. So I've had phases in my life where I like to play Monopoly. And if you've forgotten what Monopoly is like, let me just show you. This is a normal Monopoly board. And you notice there's two decks of cards, right? You guys remember this? The top right one is Community Chest. And then the bottom one, the orange one with the question mark, those are the chance cards. Remember that? The chance cards? Okay. Not in the Hanley household. No. In the Hanley household, here we go. Let's go to the next slide. It's the Providence cards. You see this? Because God is at work in all things, right? If you want to take your Monopoly game and make it more biblical, you need to change the chance cards into Providence cards. Actually, there's two other things you need to do if you want to make your Monopoly game more biblical. First of all, at the beginning of the game, you need to take all of the money and all of the property, and you need to distribute it equally amongst all of the players. Because when the Israelites came into the promised land, that's what they did. They divided up the land equally. So you divide up all the land equally. And then here's the other thing you need to do. Every 50 rolls, you need to give everybody their property back. Right? That's the year of Jubilee. Right? You want a biblical version of Monopoly? That's for you. Right now, we've just got a secular, greedy capitalist view, and that's fine, whatever. But if you want a more biblical view, those are the three things that you need to do. But for our purposes, I want to highlight here the providence. God is at work. God is orchestrating everything that is going on in the story. Okay, then, moving on. Verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" All right, now this is one of these places where, as you read the text, you kind of wonder, is it operating at a number of different levels? This is one where you can't tell the tone and the inflection that is used when Boaz talks, right? So when he asks the guy who's in charge, who is this woman? He could be saying it, very innocently as the landowner, and he sees someone on his property, and, he feels responsible. Whoever's on his property needs to know who's there. So he could very innocently, just as the landowner, be asking, who is this woman that is in the field? But you got to wonder if it was really more like, who is that woman? Right? We don't know, but you kind of got to wonder, right? And then the subtext here, it goes we see it again, right? So then later on in verse 9, we discover, and I don't have verse 9 up there, but in verse 9, we discover that Boaz has told all of the reapers who work for him, he's told them to leave her alone. He says, don't touch her. Right? And again, we don't know exactly how that conversation went. We don't know if it was, again, him just trying to make sure that nothing nefarious goes on his property. Right? Leave her alone, boys, right? But it also might have been more like, hey, guys, back off. She's mine. We don't know. It's kind of unclear. It's kind of ambiguous. But based on where this story goes, you kind of gotta wonder. The ambiguity continues in chapter 2, verse 10, when Ruth responds to Boaz's kindness. Listen to what Ruth says. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me since I am a foreigner? Now, again, we don't know how she said this, right? She might have just been like, thank you. Why are you so nice to me? Or she might have said something like, why are you being so nice to me? Right? We don't know. We don't know. It's ambiguous. We don't know. This is the beauty of romance, right? I remember when my wife and I were first getting to know each other, and we would send each other text messages. You guys know what this is about if you're in a relationship early on. And I'd get a text from her, and I'd be like, did she mean this? Or did she mean this? And then I would send her text messages, and I would intentionally make them vague. Right? I'm like, I hope she takes it this way, but if she's not ready for that, then she can take it this way, right? And so we see all of the ambiguity going on here in the text. Now, here's my point. Once again, guys, I apologize. At this point in the story, the chick flick meter is at 100%. I mean, it's about to blow. Then we come to verse 12. And Boaz says this to Ruth. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Now, in this moment, we come to discover this is not a chick flick. Or at least it's not just a chick flick. It's so much more than this. Here, what we come to discover is that this is not a story about Ruth finding favor in the eyes of some guy. This is about Ruth finding favor in the eyes of the Lord. And it's worth noting that this is what draws Boaz to her. So I will at least say this, going with the theme of relationships. If you are single and you are looking for someone, I hope you find somebody that you think's cute, think's funny and all that. But what you are looking for more than anything is someone who fears the Lord, someone who is looking to the Lord. So, Boaz is drawn to Ruth because she has found favor in the eyes of the Lord. But the question that now emerges is simply this. What is it about Ruth that qualifies her to receive the favor and blessing of God? What is it? What does Boaz see in her? What is it that she embodies that shows that she has received favor from the Lord? Here's what it is. God's favor rests on those who completely rely on him. This is what attracts Boaz to her. She's a woman who is completely reliant on God. Again, she very much exemplifies what we find in the book of Proverbs. It says, charm is deceitful and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Boaz sees this. This is a woman who fears the Lord. This is a woman who is reliant on the Lord. And in this, she wins God's favor. Now, what does it mean? What does it mean that she is reliant on the Lord? And I want to highlight two things, and really the second flows out of the first. The first one is the most important, and then the second flows out of it. But here's the two things that emerge from this text in what we see about Ruth that demonstrate to us what it means to be reliant on God. First of all, to be reliant on God means complete abandonment to God. Right? There's this sense of abandonment, this sense of leaving behind whatever was important to you in the past. And we see that Ruth literally leaves things behind, and Boaz notices this. Again, so let me read here these key verses. Verse 11. Boaz says this, and Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. And then here, look at this. And how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. You see, he notices that this willingness of her right? This willingness of her to leave behind everything. This abandonment, or that to Boaz, this is what it looked like for her to take shelter in God's wings. And I want us to see this, okay? Here's how we see this connection here on what it means to be abandoned to God and taking shelter under his wings. Is I would suggest this, that we go through life, most of what we do, literally just about everything that we do in life, what drives us, what we are doing in life is this. And basically everything that we do, this is what we're doing. We are seeking to build shelters to protect us from the negativity of life. Everything that we do, we are building shelters to protect ourselves against the negativity of life. So, for example, we are afraid of the negativity of financial ruin. Right? We're worried, like, am I going to be able to pay the bills? Am I going to be able to afford gas or food? And so what do? You seek to build a shelter to protect yourself against, financial ruin, the negativity of financial ruin. So what do? You get a job. Maybe you go to school to get a degree so you can get a job. And all of that, maybe you even find someone. You're like, okay, that person's got money. I think I'll be in good shape if I'm with them, right? You're looking, there's a million ways in which you go to try to build a shelter that will protect you from the potential of financial ruin. Right? That's one kind of shelter that we build. Another shelter that we build is a shelter that protects us from loneliness. We all have this kind of fear of being left alone. Like loneliness is like this negativity of life that we feel like it could creep in on us at any time. And so we've got to build a shelter, right, to protect ourselves from that loneliness. And so how do we do that? How do we protect ourselves from loneliness? Well, we try to find community. We try to have friends. We maybe try to find somebody to be in a relationship, right, so that we won't be alone. What are we doing? We are building a shelter to protect ourselves from the negativity of loneliness. Right? All kinds of shelters that we're doing. Here, I could keep going. I'll give you one more. Another shelter that we build for ourselves is a shelter that protects us from the fear of insignificance. Right? Many of us, we just live with this fear of being insignificant, of our lives not really having any sort of meaning. Nobody thinking us to be significant. And so what do? We build a shelter to protect ourselves against that insignificance. And how do we do that? Well, we try to perform in a particular way that will draw people's attention. People will notice us, right? Whether it's in athletics, right? Try to become the best at your sport, the best at whatever. So win the medal, win the ribbon, so that people will notice you. People will think that you are significant. We do this with our appearance. Try to be attractive so that people will notice us, think that we are significant. With our careers, right? We are performing with the hope that people will recognize us, and then this will give us significance. And this can even take place in the church. Right? Try to perform in the church so that people in the church think well of you. It's still performance. You're building a shelter that is designed to protect you from this fear of insignificance. And this is how we live our lives. Just going around building these shelters. So what does it mean to abandon ourselves to God? It means we give up those shelters. And we look to God, we look to Him to be the shelter that is going to protect us against insignificance or loneliness or whatever it is. He is our shelter. Now, look, that doesn't mean that you necessarily quit your job, break off your relationship, right? It doesn't mean that we entirely stop doing these things. I might put it this way. What we need to do is this. You need to identify what is the main point of your life. And here's what I mean by this. I want you to imagine that your life is a sermon. Right? Wonder how I came up with this analogy, right? Okay. I want you to imagine your life is a sermon. Here, when I'm making a sermon each Sunday, when I'm preparing a sermon, one of the key things I'm trying to do is figure out what is the main point. What's the main thing I'm trying to drive home here? So I like study the text, and a number of different points will emerge. And then you're trying to figure out, okay, well, which is the main point, and what are the subpoints? And so sometimes like I'll create an outline with a main point and then subpoints. And then as I'm working on it, I'll realize, actually the main point really needs to be a subpoint. And one of these subpoints needs to be the main point. Sometimes I don't figure that out until after I've preached it. Sorry about that. Sometimes that happens. But anyways, you're trying to figure out what's the main point and what are the subpoints. And the idea is that the subpoints, they are important, but they're there to support the main point. Friends, if your life was a sermon, what would be the main point and what would be the subpoints? You see this, making God your main point doesn't mean you don't have subpoints. You see this? It doesn't mean that you're not pursuing a career, you're not pursuing relationships, but they are subpoints used to support the main point, which is your pursuit of God. And that's what it means to be abandoned to Him. He becomes the main point, and everything else becomes a subpoint. So what does it look like to rely on God? First, we've seen it's this abandonment to God. But then secondly, what we see in Ruth, and it's something that really flows out of that first, is this. Reliance on God manifests itself as kindness towards others. You see, the person who's truly reliant on God is actually now in a position to be genuinely kind to others. And Boaz notices this, right? Notice the first thing that he says here. Going again, verse 11. But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. Right? He notices this, the kindness that is coming from her. And what I would suggest again is that what enables you to be kind is precisely that you're reliant on God. Did you know this, that any time we are not kind to somebody, do you know why we aren't being kind? Because we're building a shelter to protect ourselves. That's always why we aren't kind. You see, what enables a person to be kind, here's the key thing. Truly kind people, this is key. Truly kind people are not concerned about whether others are kind to them or not. They're not. Because their kindness towards others has nothing to do with whether or not others are kind to them. Right? That their kindness is an outflowing of the kindness that they have received from God. Right? Now, understand, being kind to somebody does not mean that you just let them walk over you necessarily. Or sometimes the kind thing to do, because you love them, is to tell them, hey, the way you're treating me is not good. But boy, there's a huge difference, isn't there? There's a huge difference between when you confront somebody in their sin and the way they've affected you. There's a huge difference between doing it because you're mad and you're bitter that they've attacked you and doing it because you genuinely care about them. Two totally different postures. So you see, kindness does not necessarily mean you just get walked over. It does mean, look, generally you're willing to take more. You are. You're not always calling people out. You're willing to take it. You're willing to absorb it. And you're only really calling them out when you begin to realize, boy, this is not good for them. This isn't about you. But what is it that enables this kindness to come out of us? It's precisely that we aren't building shelters to protect ourselves. We have found shelter in God's protection. So it flows out of it. Abandonment to God, reliance on God naturally leads to kindness towards others. But this begs the big question. And that is, how can I know I can rely on God? You want me to abandon my shelter building? How can I know? How can I trust that God really will be a shelter for me? How I know He will protect me? And there's something interesting here, right? Again, the way in which, let me read the verse again, in which Boaz uses this analogy of God being a shelter. Okay, here's what it says here. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, right? to take shelter under, refuge under. And notice the imagery here is the image of like a hen, a bird who protects the chicks, the hen's chicks, spreads the wings over the chicks in times of difficulty, right? Maybe there's a wild animal that's coming to attack, or a fire or something like that. And the hen comes and puts her arms over these chicks to protect them. That's the imagery that is used there. And it's an image that is used throughout the Old Testament. We find it in the book of Deuteronomy. We find it in the book of Isaiah. And we also find it in the Gospels. We find that Jesus uses this analogy as well. Notice what he says here, Luke chapter 13. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. Here Jesus is lamenting the fact that the vast majority of Israel did not follow him, did not look to him for protection. They sought instead to build their own shelters. And of course, Jesus anticipates, he knows what would happen even within 30 years. They tried to protect themselves against the Romans. It didn't go well, and Jerusalem was destroyed. And so he's lamenting over what he knows is going to happen. But it points to something even deeper than this. Ultimately, what does it do? It points to the cross. Because oftentimes what would happen when a hen would lay her wings over these chicks to protect them is that the hen would be killed. Oftentimes it would be like a fire, a barnyard fire, where the hen would put her wings over the chicks and protect the chicks, and the hen would die in order to save the chicks. And Jesus knows this is exactly what he's doing for us. Friends, how do you know that God will be your shelter and your refuge? You look to the cross. You look there and you see the love of God for you and his willingness to protect you. You see, on the cross we see that Jesus became insignificant so that we could become significant. We see on the cross that Jesus gave up companionship. He was abandoned by his disciples, abandoned by his heavenly Father. He experienced abandonment so that we could experience eternal communion, eternal companionship. He experienced death so that we could experience life. Friends, the heart of the gospel is that in Jesus we see we have a God in whom we can rely, a God who gave his life to protect us, so we can stop building shelters. Friends, what are the shelters in your life that you're building today? What are the things that you're looking to instead of God to give you your significance, to give you your companionship, to give you life? The heart of the gospel is that in Jesus we have everything that we need. And this then can enable us to live a life of kindness. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity for us to once again be reminded of God's provision for us. Again, the cross points to the reality that he is a shelter for us. On the cross, he died, took upon himself that which would have been ours, and ultimately gives us life when we trust in him. As we take the elements, may it renew our faith in him.